I don't typically pay a lot of attention to the National Prayer Breakfast. I quit going to the local observance more than 20 years ago when I realized that it was really just a public affirmation of the love affair between conservative politicians and evangelical Christianity. They always try to make it sound like the invitation is to everyone, but it really just kind of turned out to be a little too much of political PDA, a little too much hugging and kissing between conservative politicians and right-wing evangelicals. But on the national plane, the organizers feel obligated to invite the President of the United States, whoever happens to be president at the time. And even though it is clearly an event designed for the benefit of right-wingers of both political and religious bent, the president usually feels an obligation to attend. In years past, what few clips that I have heard in the news made it sound a lot like President Obama was aware that he was entering fairly hostile territory and that he was trying to polish his Christian bona fides before retreating quickly to the safety of the Oval Office. But this year, this horrible year in which religious extremism seems determined to rush us all back into the dark ages, our president decided to step up a bit at this event. He didn't just condemn ISIS and Boko Haram, whose attempt at establishing a radical Muslim caliphate has seen them capturing children and forcing them into marriage, or more honestly, selling them as sex slaves before they were even 10 years old. And even more shockingly, dousing a fellow Muslim in gasoline and burning him alive in a cage and posting the video of this event as if they were proud of the barbarism. Now, the president did condemn those things, but he also reminded his largely Christian audience that religious extremism in the Christian faith also has had its bloody history, all of the way from the Crusades through the practice of African slavery, down to the lynchings and Jim Crow history of America. Now, it was nothing that I haven't said, it was nothing that other people haven't said, but when the president came in to the prayer breakfast and said the same things that we all know are true, he created quite a tempest of furious criticism. The morning after the prayer breakfast, former Congressman and MSNBC news host Joe Scarborough just about blew a fuse on Morning Joe, mocking the president as a pseudo-intellectual and screaming about how insulting it was for him to bring up events of history that happened 800 to 1,000 years ago. Scarborough was shouting and demanding that everyone on the set agree with him, even though most tried their best to look away and avoid being engaged in the rant. But it wasn't just Scarborough that was enraged. Rush Limbaugh was also quite angry, which is, I guess, his shtick. But Jim Gilmore, the former governor of Virginia, said that the president's remarks were the most offensive words he had heard uttered by a president in his lifetime. And of course, Franklin Graham had to get into the mix to demonstrate both his lack of comprehension of history and of religion as he attempted to represent the outrage of modern evangelicals. Though many were wagging their heads and attempting to shame the president, none could actually make the claim that anything he said wasn't true. And that's what astonishes me. Of course, Scarborough tried to bury these things in the distant past, just as an absurd denial of reality. The Crusades were a millennia ago. The Inquisition was 800 years ago. But the American slave trade was not so deeply buried in history, and Jim Crow laws and lynchings remain in the memory of everyone in this room. Lynchings generally involved hanging, but sometimes the person that was being hanged was also set on fire in a public display that was not in any way different from what ISIS did to that Jordanian pilot. There have also been incidents, even within recent history, of dragging a body behind a truck or a horse until the body actually fell apart. Racially inspired lynchings continued right up into the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. And I just want to remind you of the 1998 lynching of Matthew Shepard in Laramie, Wyoming, who was a 21-year-old university student who was murdered on the suspicion that he had made a gay pass at a couple of other students in a bar. These events were Christian in more or less the same way that the immolation of the captured Jordanian pilot was Islamic. We can say that the KKK has nothing to do with real Christianity in the same way that Muslims can say that ISIS and Boko Haram are not Islamic, but it's not all that hard to draw the lines. There are many official Islamic organizations that have made loud statements condemning Muslim terrorism. And we should all be reminded as we debate that we don't want to put any boots on the ground to fight ISIS, but already there have been more than 40,000 Muslims that have died fighting ISIS. So you should not think of ISIS as an isolated Muslim event. But what worries many of us here on this side of the ocean is that there is still way too much sympathy within Muslim congregations for the events of Muslim terrorism. And while the practice of racially motivated lynchings in America peaked in the 1890s, there was still far too much sympathy for modern atrocities hidden in our own Christian churches during the Civil Rights Movement, and not a little violent homophobia lurking right up into the 90s when Matthew Shepard was murdered. And it's not gone yet. When we read the Synoptic Gospels, it is evident that high on the list of the memories of Matthew, Mark, and Luke was the memory of Jesus as a demon exorcist. And most of us have been inclined to read such things with a mixture of embarrassment and skepticism. Clearly, some of these accounts were primitive descriptions of epilepsy or of mental illness, but the gospel writers describe them in a very matter-of-fact way, as real and present and disgusting creatures that lived among us. Of course, I don't take such accounts as being literal, but I want to tell you I do believe in demons, and I believe they live among us. The ancients talked about demons as external things, and that's a trick of psychology that's persisted through the centuries. Demons, in the sense of grave and horrible social evil, exist, but we always like to project them onto something external. I'm a Democrat, so Republicans are evil. I'm an American, so Russians are evil. I'm a Christian, so Muslims are evil. We know that evil exists. It frightens us. Out of fear, we do extreme things with our military, with our police, in mob mentalities. Out of fear, we seek to annihilate the other that we always imagine as being external. But what the Gospels always seem to say is that the demons are actually quite close at hand. In the passage just before the one that Patricia read for us in Mark, Jesus does his first miracle in the Gospel of Mark, and it was a demon exorcism. And what I've always found captivating about that story, where did he encounter the demon? In church. It was in church. I always wonder, how long had that demon been attending that church? And nobody had noticed. Nobody was aware. I take these accounts to be metaphorical, of course, but that doesn't mean that they're not true. Metaphor is not a lie. Metaphor is a representation, an artistic and a literary representation of something that is more true, that has a deeper truth. We tend to make peace with the demons that are the most familiar to us. I can tell you existentially, I grew up going to a segregated school, and I didn't know it was segregated. It never occurred to me that my school was segregated. I worked with the children of black tenant farmers that lived around my neighborhood. We worked on the farms that surrounded us, but it never occurred to me to ask where they go to school. It didn't even occur to me to notice that there was just white kids at my school. I was a blissfully ignorant white Southern boy who had not spent a moment thinking about the injustice, the violence, the oppression of America's apartheid until segregation was ended by judicial, we called it coercion. No one at my church, and I went to church every Sunday, no one at my church ever mentioned segregation as being something wrong. The death of Martin Luther King that April morning in 1964 was not mentioned. No one in my church said that Martin Luther King should have been shot, but no one mourned the fact that he had been shot. And racism could comfortably come and go from the sanctuary of that church for many more years. I'm pretty sure it was 64. April 4th? 68, right? April 4th? Okay, I stand corrected. The evangelicals who were so offended by the president's prayer breakfast comments do not want to see that there is a connection between Christian extremism and Islamic extremism. They do not want to see how their history of racism is made of the same cloth as the more current excesses of jihadists. But it is. What I find captivating about the way the Gospels describe these stories is that somehow when Jesus showed up, something about Jesus, something in his character, something in his demeanor, his honesty, his integrity, made the demons visible. Like turning on the kitchen light in some of my old college apartments would reveal all the cockroaches that lived in the student slums. They would run for cover, but you could never tell yourself they weren't there. You'd seen them. They were there. Our problem is that we get so comfortable with our demons, so comfortable that we can pretend like they don't exist. They become so much a part of the scenery that we get really angry when someone points them out. When someone says that our culture, our Christian culture, also has demonic elements. We get used to industries that ruin the environment. We accept that our poor neighborhoods have the most underfunded schools while our wealthy neighborhoods have the best schools, and never let ourselves acknowledge that it obviously should be the other way around. We have twice as many foreclosed upon houses as we have homeless people, and yet we say there's no way to house the homeless. 1% of our nation holds 90% of our capital assets, and yet we say there is not enough to solve the problem of poverty in America. Most political donations are made by less than 1 in 100,000 Americans, and yet we refuse to hear that we have sold our democracy to the highest bidder. I drive past 15 to 20 payday loan shops on my way to work. Several sex shops, most of which sell this week's version of meth. They keep changing the chemical compounds that go into making meth, and so they sell them as bath salts or as plant fertilizers, preying on the poor and the desperate. And we don't notice because we're not poor and desperate yet. Historically, we've had a tendency to kill the people who reveal the demons of our culture rather than to be outraged by the presence of the demons. Too much of our society is content to live with the cockroaches and just insist that no one ever turn on the lights. I don't know about you, but I'd like to be more like Jesus. I want to turn on the lights. I want to be, even if I'm not able to drive out all of the demons in society, I don't want them to think that I don't care, that they're hiding under the refrigerator and in the kitchen cabinets. Islam does need to change, and so does Christianity. And let me tell you, so does Judaism. But the demons we have to fight are not out there or over there. Those problems are probably not our problems to solve. We have plenty that are close at hand that we need to deal with within our own hearts and within our own culture. But first, we have to be willing to turn on the lights and to be honest about what we see.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.